Well, good morning. My name is John. I'm one of the pastors here, and I have the privilege of batting leadoff on our new sermon series, God with Us. Let's dive right in. We're going to look this morning at 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Maybe you brought a Bible. If you didn't, you can find this on page 1623 of your pew Bibles, 1 Corinthians chapter 1. And as you're going to that page, a little context is in order before we look at the words here. Apostle Paul, who wrote the words that we'll be looking at this morning, had established a church in the city of Corinth, which was one of the most important cities in Greece. Several trade routes met at Corinth, and because of its strategic location, it had a very diverse population. It was a Greek city controlled by the Romans, and it also attracted plenty of Jews, Latins, Syrians, Asians, and Egyptians, many of them there because of the trade. So Corinth was full of important, prosperous, cosmopolitan, and intellectual people. And many of them were unfamiliar with the message of Jesus. So Corinth was the perfect place for the Apostle Paul to preach the gospel. And he knew that if he had success there, the message of Jesus would spread along with the trade routes. So Paul planted the church, but not too long afterwards, maybe because it was so diverse, conflict began to arise within the community. So Paul writes a letter to the church in Corinth from where he is in Ephesus, which is just across the Aegean Sea. And he writes it to remind them of what was the core principle of the gospel message. So let's pick up Paul's letter at verse 17. Paul writes, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, not with wisdom and eloquence, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power." Now, Paul's not saying that he never baptized anyone. The verses right before these demonstrate that he did. What he's saying is that the act of baptizing wasn't his primary reason for planting the church in Corinth. His primary reason was, he says, to preach the gospel, the good news of Jesus. That makes sense, right? But the words he says after that don't quite make sense. He says, I wanted to preach the gospel, but not with wisdom and eloquence. Now, why would a preacher say that? Don't preachers want to preach effectively? Didn't Paul want to? I think he did, but I think his point here is that he didn't want his hearers to focus on the style of his message. He wanted them instead to focus on the content of the message. And what was the content, the core content? The cross of Jesus Christ. Paul knew that the cross is what held the real power, not how clever, not how wise his preaching was. Then we go on to verse 18, which is the most important verse that we will look at this morning. Paul writes, "For the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." That's quite a contrast. Foolishness to some, the power of God to others. Now, how can that be? The Greek word that's here translated foolishness is moria. Moria. It's the word from which we get the English word moron. Isn't that fascinating? To put it bluntly, Paul is saying that to the unsaved world, those who preach a message of the cross look like idiots, fools. And we know from the book of Acts that the early Christians and Paul were indeed ridiculed for their beliefs, which seemed to run counter, totally irrational, to the prevailing cultural norms. In fact, later in this letter, in chapter 4, Paul goes on to say, "It seems to me that God has put us apostles on display like those condemned to die in the arena. We've been made a spectacle to the whole universe. We are fools for Christ." Fools for Christ. Now, I don't know about you, but if I was in Paul's shoes and was looking to recruit converts, I think I would have chosen a slightly different strategy. I might have come up with a different analogy, a little bit more attractive. Becoming a fool for Christ sounds more like a recruiting pitch for a court jester than it does for a committed disciple. I think I would have used an analogy that carried a little more dignity and at least a modicum of self-respect. So what in the world was Paul thinking? Well, for starters, we have to remember that the cross for Paul meant something very different than it does in our world today. And for proof, I need to look no further than the authoritative Elle magazine, a strong, authoritative source. Elle magazine recently published a piece entitled, "How Cross Jewelry Became a Fashion Statement." The article features someone named Lily Sisto. I'd never heard of her. Maybe you have. She is apparently a fashion influencer. Lily, we're told, identifies as Christian, but doesn't think that's a precursor to wearing a cross in the year 2025. Lily says, "Of course, it's a part of my religion, but I also think a cross is so beyond chic to wear. It can be a fashion statement. You don't need to be religious to wear one." Needless to say, 2,000 years ago, for the Apostle Paul, the cross was not beyond chic. What it was the Romans' preferred instrument of capital punishment. And it was an effective one at that. It was cruel, it was gruesome, and it was highly effective, not only as a means of execution, but as a deterrent to future crime. In crucifixion, the condemned person would be nailed or tied to a cross with arms either straight above or, to prolong the agony, outstretched to the side. Victims would die in anywhere from a matter of minutes to a matter of days. And the difference there often depended on how much they had been beaten before they were nailed to the cross. So Paul is saying that to all those who are not open to the gospel, a message of hope and power and salvation that features a cross is ludicrous. It's foolish. In fact, a message that includes the cross conveys just the opposite: hopelessness, weakness, and death. It's foolish. So we need to understand this morning just how radical Paul's message was, that the cross was in any way good news. Paul knew that he needed to bolster his argument, his case, so he borrows some words from the prophet Isaiah in verse 19 to remind his readers that this kind of a head-scratching message from God really isn't anything new. Because even before the Messiah, the prophets of old challenged God's people to a radical form of obedience, one that was countercultural to the message of the day, one that went far beyond engaging just the mind. And Jesus himself said that the greatest commandment wasn't just to love God with your mind, but also with your heart and your soul and your strength. And then Paul goes on to use some hyperbole to strengthen his case. Verse 20. Where's the wise person? Where's the teacher of the law? Where's the philosopher of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? All of their wisdom, isn't it foolish? Paul calls out the intellectual heavyweights of his day, and he figuratively puts them in their place. Wise elders, legal scholars, philosophers. It would be like calling out Einstein, Da Vinci, and Shakespeare and saying, they're nothing. They don't know what they're talking about. Scandalous. Who would do that? Paul is trying to get their attention, and I think he's successful. He's saying that human wisdom by itself is ultimately useless when it comes to our salvation. It takes more than that. God wants all of us, not just our mind, but our heart, our soul, our body as well. And Paul's saying that in the world's eyes, the message of God's salvation coming through an implement of torture looks ridiculous. Then, Paul gets even more specific. He starts naming names. Verse 22, Jews demand signs. Greeks look for wisdom. But we preach Christ and him crucified. That's a stumbling block to Jews, and it's foolishness to Gentiles. But to those whom God has called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. Before his own radical conversion, Paul had been a pious Jew. So he knew that the law, the Jewish law, considered anyone who died on a cross to be cursed. And he remembered that the Pharisees in Jesus' time were always demanding that he give a sign, something to prove that he actually was the Messiah. Paul also knew that the Greeks valued wisdom above all else, and they revered the philosophers for their intellectual insights. So by naming both Jews and Greeks, Paul is making an umbrella statement that includes everybody. He's saying the message of the cross seems foolish to everyone because it contradicts conventional wisdom, and it turns the definition of power and success on its head. Anyone who would say to Paul, aren't all religions basically the same? Paul would say, not a chance, because of the cross. The cross makes everything different. Then and now. Episcopal priest and author Fleming Rutledge puts it this way. She writes, Christianity is unique. The world's religions have certain traits in common, but until the gospel of Jesus Christ burst upon the Mediterranean world, no one in the history of human imagination had conceived of such a thing as the worship of a crucified man. The last word from Paul to us this morning is a pithy summation of his argument. Verse 25, for the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. In a nutshell, Paul is saying, I know how this looks to you. I know it sounds crazy. I know it's unconventional, but trust me. Better yet, trust God. Being a fool in God's eyes is far wiser than human strength. And being weak in God's eyes is far stronger than human strength. Ever since Paul wrote these words, followers of Jesus have tried to make sense of the contradictions. It's hard. It's hard to do. They've tried to answer the question, why should I take the risk of looking like a fool to embrace the foolishness of the cross? Perhaps no one in recent memory has answered that question more succinctly and more cogently than a man named Jim Elliot. Jim Elliot was an American missionary in the 1950s who was called to evangelize a remote tribe in the country of Ecuador. This tribe was known to be extremely distrustful of outsiders and prone to violence to defend themselves. It was, needless to say, a very risky and a very dangerous calling. After 4 long and hard years of faithful effort, Jim Elliot and 4 other missionaries were tragically martyred while doing their evangelistic work. But after their deaths, their cause was taken up successfully, I might add, by others, including Jim Elliot's young wife. After his death, a line from Elliot's journal came to light, which has lived on to this day and which casts Paul's words, I think, in their proper perspective. Jim Elliot wrote this: "He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain that which he cannot lose." So this morning, as we begin our Lenten journey to the cross, we are left with some important questions, and challenging ones as well. Questions like, how do we make sense of the foolishness of the cross in our lives? How are we called to the holy work and the risky business of being fools for Christ? Let me tell you about how one friend of mine tackled those questions. More than 30 years ago, our church and a group of other local congregations banded together to respond to a devastating famine which was taking place in the Horn of Africa. And our church and others, one of the primary ways that we responded was to take trips, to go and see not just the devastation of the famine, but to also see the powerful effects of the mission partners we were working with to make a difference. One of the other churches, along with CPC, that was involved in this effort was Colonial Church, now called Meeting House Church, just a couple miles from here. The senior pastor of CPC, Roger Anderson, and the senior pastor of Colonial, Arthur Rauner, both led their church's efforts to make a difference in Africa. The story is told of one Lenten Sunday morning at Colonial Church. Pastor Rauner was preaching from the pulpit, spoke about an upcoming trip to Africa. At the end of the service, he walked out into the lobby and made a beeline to one of the parishioners, my friend Ward, and he said to Ward, "I'd like you to join me on my next trip to Africa." Now, Ward was a successful businessman with a young family and a very full calendar. He'd never been to Africa, and he was not about to go. And he made that point very clear to his pastor. At which point, Pastor Arthur said, "Well, why don't you pray about it?" And Ward said, "You're the pastor. You pray about it." "I'll think about it." Which he promptly did not, because there was no more discussion for Ward. Unbeknownst to Ward, his pastor did pray about it. And a few weeks later, one of Ward's close friends approached him and said, "You know what, I just signed up for that Africa trip. I think you ought to come with me." And Ward thought, "Are you kidding me? You're going?" Well, that got him to thinking, well, if he's going, maybe I could go. So he thought, I know how to shoot this down. I'll mention it to my wife. She will never go for it. She went for it. She said, "I think that's a great idea. You ought to go." Ward thought, okay, my buddy's going. I'll do the stupid trip. He signed up. Weeks passed. The day of the trip was approaching. Ward's friend gave him a call and said, "Buddy, sorry, something came up at work. I got to back out. You're on." And Ward thought, are you kidding me? You're the only reason I'm going. He wasn't happy. He started thinking, how can I get out of this trip? And he realized if I go on this trip, it'll be me, my senior pastor, and a bunch of what Ward called church ladies. He was not excited about it, but he couldn't come up with a good excuse. He'd already cleared his calendar. He'd already gotten all the shots. He thought, okay, I'll go. The day came for the trip to leave. The group gathered at MSP Airport at the departure gate, and to Ward's horror, his pastor, Arthur, called the group together and said, "Let me pray over us before we go." Now, Ward had never experienced anything like this in private, let alone in public. He said to me, the only thing I could think was, I hope none of my clients see me here. Ward felt like a fool. And as he boarded that plane, he realized all of his business expertise, all of his success, all of his achievements, which had allowed him to live in luxury in a suburban existence, all of that was now useless as he stepped on that plane and took off for Africa with his pastor and a bunch of church ladies. A funny thing happened to my friend Ward on that trip. He came back a transformed man, completely changed. He encountered, as he had never had before, the poorest of the poor, living in grinding poverty, but also living with a vibrant faith, a faith he had never experienced in his suburban life. He realized they're seeing with new eyes, and I want those eyes in my life. And so Ward, after several more trips to Africa, decided to commit himself to making a difference. And he took all of his business experience, all of his skills, all of his success, and he laid it at the foot of the cross and said, Jesus, if you've got something in me that you can use, take it and use it. And use it, he did. Just a few short years later, Ward Brem would be appointed by President George Bush to serve on the board of the U.S. Africa Development Foundation, a government agency established by our Congress to invest directly in grassroots enterprises in Africa to help create jobs and promote self-reliance. Ward has continued to serve in this capacity for more than 20 years, under 4 U.S. presidents. And he has impacted, lifted up countless lives, millions of lives in Africa. In the year 2008, Ward Brem, successful businessman, social entrepreneur, and fool for Jesus Christ, was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his service, our country's second highest civilian award. And because Ward had always been quick to give Jesus credit for calling him to serve, he was also invited in that year to give the keynote address at the National Prayer Breakfast in Washington, D.C. He was the first person from the business community ever to be invited by Congress to do so. That agency that Ward has led and continues to lead, right now, he's fighting to keep it from being eliminated by our federal government because he knows it has transformed lives. Friends, I don't know what God is calling you to this Lent. I don't know how the Lord wants to prepare you to encounter Jesus on the cross. I know that for some of us, maybe we've given up something like chocolate. There's nothing wrong with that. That's fine. But I would invite you this Lent, maybe like you've never done before, to consider something a little more radical, a little more foolish, if you will. I would invite you to consider how you might redefine success and significance. I'd invite you to take your gifts, your skills, your unique experiences, and lay them at the foot of the cross and see what Jesus can do with them. Because the amazing thing is, the Lord doesn't just take our strengths, he takes what the world might call our weaknesses, our failures, our brokenness. And when we lay those at the cross, those can be used as well. I don't know what that might mean for you. Maybe you need to finally take that first mission trip. Or maybe it means just inviting your neighbor or that coworker or that friend you've met at your kid's school to come to church with you, or to check out Alpha, or to go serve at the shelter. Maybe it means taking the risk of inviting some friends to start a small group, or inviting someone to be that spiritual companion we heard about, where you talk not just about sports or food or vacations or your kids, but you talk about faith, what that looks like in your lives. This Lent, do you want to just stop eating chocolate for a while? Or do you want to take a risk, a real risk, a risk of being called a fool for Jesus Christ? Because I think when we do, we might see someone's life changed, and it might just be your own. Amen.